showing up for the open source demos, not demos. Demos simply means the electorate, so who is entitled to vote. A little bit about myself and the cooperative I'm a part of. It's called Vote Co-op, started in 2012. All development, some closed, some open. We prefer open. One of the projects that I work on, or the major project that I work on, is called the CNF Test Suite, which is a cloud-native network function test suite. Essentially tests telecommunications software and hardware. It's for the CNCF, so it's an official CNCF certification. And if you're not familiar with CNCF, it's the people who are basically the caretakers of Kubernetes, if you're familiar with that. All right, so what are we going to learn today? And I guess I'm going to say now, there's probably a little, and in the last talk, I think he alluded to this, there's kind of an elephant in the room between open source and cooperatives. So I'm going to try to tease some of that out. Today, we're going to try to figure out what are the right questions to ask when you design an open source demo, so an electorate, an open source organization. We're going to define what an open source organization is as well. We're going to clarify democracy. You may have some different ideas on what democracy is. We're going to try to make that a little bit more clear and use that within our framing. And then some other tools that we're going to use, or problems that we're going to try to solve. One of them that is within political science is called the boundary problem. And if you've ever dealt with an open source organization and tried to reason about some type of voting apparatus, you ran into this problem a little bit. And it's interesting to hear people dance around it. Some other principles, you have the affected interest principle. That's going to be, these are principles within political science for helping you to reason about democracy. You've got the nosy preferences, over and under inclusion. There's some other ones called transients and externalities, and those are what I call constraints. So let's get into this a little bit. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with Jonah Bacon, but he wrote The Art of Community, and he has a decent definition of open source governance. So there's the open source project, so the code, and there's how you govern the code. And there's three really types of governance. And the more popular one is a benevolent dictatorship, and so that's number one really. Then now you have other types. So the enlightened dictatorship, what does that mean? Essentially, it's based off of, there's no official person who handles the decisions and that can make binding decisions. But it's really based off of reputation. Well, some people think that it's a meritocracy, but we'll dig a little bit into it. But it's really between, like what Jonah Bacon observes, it's really reputation, who is going to make the binding decisions. And then you have delegated governance. And so to reason about this, or to think about this and how he describes it, it's really when the contributors delegate authority to make decisions to smaller groups. So there could be a working group, there could be a SIG, a special interest group that deals with verticals, and then there could be a technical oversight committee, or different types of smaller groups, and all of those groups together will be the governing body. And so he kind of implicitly is saying that's the more mature open source governance style. And if anybody wants to, we can do this interactive if you want to. So if people have questions as we go along, because it's going to be pretty dense. And I'll say now, This is based off of a paper that I've submitted to political science journals. So I tried to tease out some of the concepts and make it to where, it's kind of easier to reason about. So when we're talking about democracy in relation to open source, delegated governance is really the one that is going to be democratic. The other ones don't really adhere to democracy, so and we'll tease a little bit of that out more as we go along. But having the contributors actually elect some type of group, okay, there's some election going on there, okay, it's democratic. Now, thinking about what the definition of democracy is, there's a contemporary view, and this is lifted from Carol Pateman's book, The Participatory Democracy, or Participation in Democratic Theory. There's a counterintuitive truth in that book. What many may not know is that the contemporary view, which is heavily influenced by a guy named Joseph Schumpeter, the contemporary view is that it's really electoral politics. But, okay, you elect a representative to handle your stuff. But inside of that is the idea that the regular populace, the electorate, they're apathetic. Political scientists say that citizens that are part of democracy they do not care. They want to they want someone else to handle all of the decision making. That's the contemporary view. And it gets a little bit more nefarious than that. I won't get too much into it, but basically they think it's dangerous for the average person, what they call the majority, to participate. That's the contemporary view of democracy. Now, the participatory view is that the average person that's in a demos, in an electorate, they should participate. And we should be doing everything to try to get them to participate. Participate in what? In the decision making. So we'll get a little bit more into defining what that means. But now trying to bring that over to open source, you have another book here, David Ellerman. People that are familiar with cooperatives, they know about Richard Wolff and Democracy at Work, and all his material is great material. David Ellerman, he's out of MIT, and he's really a mathematician, but he's also a philosopher, and he really is able to tease out a lot of the fundamental principles for worker-owned firms, and that's his book there. And the elephant in the room, I'm going to argue, is that the fundamental principles that we love in cooperatives, in open source, we kind of ignore them. We turn a blind eye. So one of them is, and really the major one is, that whenever there's a worker and they produce something, they have the right to the fruits of their labor. Okay, so to be clear, if I'm planting corn and I'm watering it all year and then someone else harvests the corn, that's unfair somehow, right? I should have at least a say in who gets to have that corn. That's the fruit of the labor. Now, here's a thing to internalize and think about. That argument is the rationale that the abolitionists used against indentured servitude, not slavery, but voluntary, hey, I want to be, I'll be a slave to you for 7 years. That's actually not enforceable, right? It's illegal in that you can't enforce it. You can sign the contract, say, pledge it, whatever, and then it cannot bring you to court, right? The rationale behind that is this concept of property, which is fruit of labor and all that. Try to think about some way that you would argue against indentured servitude without that. That same concept, the fruit of the labor and all that stuff, you can apply it to open source, right? But you also, this is the rationale against what they call wage slavery and all this other stuff. So within open source, you have contributors, and so you have users, you have contributors, and all this thing. Anyone who's the contributor, David Ellerman would use the term direct interest. So whoever is producing anything, they have a right to the outputs, and which are negative or positive. So you could be profit or something negative. You should get that. And they call it an inalienable right. You can't give it up. Remember what I just said about the indentured servitude. You can't sign off on it. It's not like the same types of rights, transferable rights for property, like your house. You can't transfer yourself to someone else. You can't transfer, the argument is you can't transfer the fruit of the labor to someone else. With open source, there's fruits of the labor. So one of the things, it's like, okay, the license, right? What type of license? If I'm the contributor or I'm part of the original person working on it or whatever, I should have some type of voting ability to participate in decision making on the licensing and all these other things, even though it's a non-rival good, basically a good that can't be excluded from other people. So what I just all talked about is really the fundamentals of anti-exploitation. It's really a definition of exploitation and saying this is how you stop it. Right? And like what I just said, with open source, benevolent dictatorship. So not having the contributors be a part of the decision-making process for the fruit of the labor is the norm. So that's the elephant in the room. It's just really uncomfortable to talk about when you're dealing with this, right? So, and I'll say a little bit more. The motivation for me for this paper was I have to work with the telco industry, and you have different types of users, right? So maybe related to the multiple stakeholders. You have service providers, so you have your AT&Ts, Verizon, and all that, and they purchase stuff. They purchase stuff at like $2 billion a contract, like every 2 years, from vendors, so your Cisco's, Nokia's, and all that. They both have competing interests, and they're in and everything I deal with is all open source. The open source software for dealing with Kubernetes, all that stuff. They all want to say we're in the cloud now, and all of these phrases and all that. And that's my world. But they are incentivized to not work with each other. And who is it that can vote on how projects go forward? When you're dealing with individuals, it's one level of politics. When you're dealing with whole marketing departments, it's another level of politics, with big companies fighting against each other and trying to referee it. So this is kind of the reason why this paper and this talk came through. So the boundary problem. This is the paradox for dealing with creating who can vote, reasoning about it. Essentially, you have to, in order to talk about the boundary problem, you really need to talk a little bit about what's called the affected interest principle. But basically, you need to, if you're going to have some kind of legitimate decision-making that affects a group, if some decisions affect a group, they, in order for it to be legitimate, need to have input into, they need to participate in the decision-making. Right? That's the affected interest principle. Well, if you're deciding who the group's going to be, like how, so you have a chicken and egg problem. How are you going to get authority to say who's in this group? You would have to include them in the decision-making process. So you have a nasty little problem here. On one side, people will say, well, this is the reason why to throw it all out, the baby out with the bathwater. So what? But on the other side, we do democracy and all this stuff all the time. And you have political science, which you can, like they've already reasoned about this. We don't have to try to do it. Well, we can try, but it's good to let the people who have been doing it all their life to have some input into this problem. What are implications of the boundary problem? How do we decide who has authority to vote if we first need decision-making authority, right? What happens in some of these other things is what I'm calling constraints. What happens when you include too many people? Like you're designing this thing, and okay, too many people are involved. Oh, okay, too few were involved. And when I say involved, they don't have the ability to vote, let's just say, participate in the decision making. And what about these people who can come in the community and then leave? Like maybe on a daily or weekly basis or monthly, they're not really, what do they get to do? Do they get to vote or they don't get to vote? These are all problems that will make someone say, yeah, benevolent dictatorship or whatever I say goes kind of thing. It's like, I'm done, right? But, countries have to deal with this. And so it's a thing that is within political science. So the solution that was created, and not the bootstrapping, but the boundary problem was coined by a guy named Whelan. All of these are from political science papers where they all, reference certain very influential papers, and then they all take a stab at trying to solve it. But the bootstrapping, which you can be familiar with, like Linux kernel and all this stuff, we have our concepts of bootstrapping within development. They have a concept of bootstrapping. And so it's essentially, it's a two-phase process. You have this pre-political group, right? And you have a post-political group, that's going to be the electorate. The pre-political group, how do we get around the problem? So you have the principle of affected interest. So essentially, everybody who is affected by some decisions, they need to be included. But you also have the principle of consent. And then you have the idea of impartial treatment, right? And so in order to make this legitimate formation of the second group, you basically advertise or something like that. Say, hey, you can be a part of this. Decision-making body is going to say who's going to be in this group. And so people can elect to be in or not. But you don't have the right to say, well, you didn't elect, so we're going to do things that affect you in a negative way. No, it needs to be impartial treatment in order to not violate their rights and all this stuff. And this is going to be a way around. This is a bootstrapping problem to get around the boundary problem or the bootstrapping solution. And so the more you tease out some of these principles, it starts to actually make a little bit more sense. So affected interest. So again, affected interest principle is whoever is affected by some decisions, they should participate in those decisions. That's the affected interest principle. There are constraints around this that help you to reason about it. And here are some of them. We're going to talk about them. Nosy preferences, under-inclusion, over-inclusion, externalities, and transients. So you need to, this is like a framework when you're reasoning about trying to create who's going to be able to participate in the decision-making, voting, however you're going to do it. You need to be familiar with these because all you're going to do is run into these and then give up, essentially. So there's really no way around it. What is under-inclusion? It's essentially including too few people. Well, what does that mean? Well, with open source, benevolent dictatorship. If you believe in the affected interest principle and whoever's affected by some decisions, they should be involved, well, benevolent dictatorship, there's no electorate. There's one person in charge. This is conceded by Jonah Bacon, all that. But even in enlightened dictatorship, which is kind of what some people might think of as a meritocracy, is really a reputational side. What happens with there? Some people can gain more reputation. They're not really that much of a contributor, and then they have disproportionate effect and voting power and all this stuff. And so it ends up being the voting of who are contributors or whatever, they are not able to have the fruit of labor, all this stuff like that. And then you have corporate influence, which is when you're dealing with the bigger projects and all that, this is pay to play. You have the corporate come in and say, okay, we paid for a spot on the board or whatever, and you have other contributors who don't have that same power. And so this is all, how the bigger projects and open source, this is stuff you have to reason about and be able to communicate that, okay, this is not fair, or is this pragmatic? Is this the only way the world can work? Can we make it more fair? You need to be able to communicate these things. Externalities, you may be familiar with this as far as from the economics side. It's some type of bad thing that happens when the market doesn't solve it, right? So there's a view within democracy, right, or political science. It's essentially, at least you have one organization, and they do things that they cause harm to another organization, right? And the market, right, they don't receive repercussions for the harm they cause. And the second organization doesn't have voting rights. That's the part where it comes in for political science, right? So that's an externality. An example of externality within open source would be, I could use a project, didn't really happen, but I can use a project, Prometheus. It's a metrics project, server for cloud. I'll say, hey, let's have an open standard called Open Metrics, right? So it's like basically a standard of JSON. This is how we emit metrics. And other projects can consume, emit, and all that, and everyone can be nice and work together. Well, what if Prometheus, who's the big dog, they turn around and say, you know what, I'm going to change the standard every time that our API changes. Every single time. And I mean, it helps us. Oh, too bad for you. That would be an externality. They're incentivized to do that. It would be very nice to change a standard every time your project changed, right? That would be a problem. Then you have corporate influences also with externalities. And this usually causes under-inclusion. So as far as the corporate influences, pay to play, it's essentially you don't get a say, you don't get a vote, you can't be a part of the decision-making process, and so you're under-included. So under-inclusion is a nasty problem within trying to figure out who can vote. Nosy preferences. This one could be a little bit easier to understand, and it's very important. So if you can imagine, you have your bathroom, let's say the color of it is green, and then you have a neighbor that says, you know what, green makes me nauseous. So what your bathroom color affects me. So I deserve a say in the decision-making process when you make the color or you paint your bathroom wall. That seems ridiculous. And this is used as a critique of the affected interest principle by a famous libertarian named Robert Nozick. Right? He basically says, yeah, because of that, forget about all that. Let markets decide all of it, and that's it. So directed interest, the people who are creating they're the ones who get to decide. You can't reason about it. Now you have a pushback there from political science, political scientist David Owen. Essentially, it's like the only thing that's kind of intuitive, right? The only thing that you are, in order to make your decisions legitimate, you can have a legitimate disinterest in someone else's being affected. So you aren't bound to care about someone caring about your affected by the color in your bathroom, because it doesn't affect their rights. It doesn't affect our autonomy. It doesn't affect all that, right? So you can be legitimately, and the key word in political science, legitimate. So it's bound in ethics, and this is used for argumentation for saying this is right. Otherwise, it's just might makes right, and anybody does whatever, right? So that's why it's important. You can have a legitimate disinterest in someone. This also helps with the bootstrapping problem. This is kind of the magic that makes it work. You can be legitimately disinterested, it's a weird thing, in people who didn't want to participate when you were trying to allow them to vote, if that makes sense. Transients. This one is basically people, like I said before, people who are getting in and out of the electorate. What is in open source? What is that? Oh, people showing up on a weekly call and saying, hey, I want to be able to have a strong opinion on the documentation. I have a strong opinion on this, on these features. And they only show up like once every 6 months or whatever. That's a transient. Okay. Do you allow them to have voting rights or not, or participate in the decision? And when I say participate in the decision-making process, that means being able to make a binding decision. That doesn't mean being there and just listening. So it's called full participation in the Carol Payment book, right? They're only in electorate for short periods of time. There can also be situation, and I don't know how familiar you all are, this open source politics or whatever. There could be a project that has long-term contributors, and then they show up at another project's weekly, monthly, or whatever. Every now and then, right when it matters, they're doing this feature or some type of documentation trying to maybe capture the meaning behind some phrases or something like that, and they'll show up in force intermittently and then say, oh yeah, we're here, we deserve a say and right and binding and all that, to another project, right? And so that would be, there's perverse incentives, what's called perverse incentives in that situation. So one project that really wants to control either a narrative or feature set, or they can go in and say, no, we want you to do these features. We don't want you to do those features because we offer those. You all should be complementary to us or some other thing, or more perverse. That would be, you have all these issues when you're dealing about who can participate in decision making. Then you have over-inclusion, just including too many people. This is really nosy preferences. We talked about that before. And then you have bike shedding, so this is Parkinson's law. Essentially, people oftentimes have a very strong opinion on where it's not warranted. So the color of the bike shed, if you will. Why is this important within political science? This is a strange thing, but they actually, because of most people with the majority, they're apathetic. They don't really vote, they don't really care. So if you over-include, no big deal. They basically the different randomness of their voting will cancel each other out. Well, when you have bike shedding, then you have a problem. They do care, and they will just on something that doesn't really matter. And then another thing with over-inclusion is the transient, so people popping in, being able to vote or not. So those are all the constraints. Pretty tough but when you're dealing with this problem, you're going to have to have some position, and it helps you to reason about all of it. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, just don't. There's hundreds of years of people already thinking about this stuff. Constraint solutions, federal organizations might be intuitive to you. So you have one project, I said Prometheus. You have open metrics. Let's say Prometheus, they're cool dudes, but let's say that they weren't. We're going to do some manipulation or whatever, and you have another project like, we want to serve metrics as well, and you guys keep changing everything. Well, you have a federal entity. So when you have two projects, you can have a third project, but wherever they can't decide whatever it is that they can't decide on, it's handled by the third entity, the federal. So there you go. And they both have voting rights in there. So you don't have one showing up on another one demanding voting rights on everything. They all can just do it on the top. And then another counterintuitive thing, political science, as far as dealing with transients, most democracies, the vast majority of democracies don't allow transients. They just say, no, you can't vote. Too bad. So that's what they do. Also, as a somewhat of a side note, it's really a trade-off. Again, I said contemporary view, and really within political science, the fear within democracy and a high priority is stability. Well, what does that mean? Stability within democracy, what does that mean? Essentially, when your governance structure, so democracy, fails, it becomes authoritarian. And they use the argument from like Germany in the 40s, Myanmar, and say, hey, they were actually democratic. And then they voted into authoritarian. And this is political science saying, actually, a lot of people will prefer authoritarian. So that's the contemporary view. And so stability is a high priority. So this is a trade-off between not allowing transients, people who don't experience the long-term repercussions, and preferring stability. It's okay to do that, right? And so what does the open source demos, so electorate, look like? So if you're going to be designing who can vote, you need to know to legitimately do it, you need to care about what they care about. Designing who can vote for open source, there's all types of surveys that have already been done that you can look at and see what they care about. Here's a couple. There's a book, Commingled Code. Essentially, the premise of the book is that a great deal, if not most, of open source comes with closed source, for the total package when people are using it. Take that for what you will. But when talking about the types of, when you're talking about contributors, to keep the doors open, how do they make money, right? What does it look like for an open source developer to make money? They take different forms. One of them is a pure developer. They just create original open source and all that. You have custom developers who customize another piece of open source, and then they're essentially selling that, doing something to where they're selling that. Bundlers, this is huge. A lot of open source is bundled with hardware, right? So thinking about, you could have proprietary hardware. So open is one for code. What about hardware? That's a whole, I have to deal with that. White box, what's called white boxes and all this stuff where you have open APIs around the hardware. The hardware can be open too, or not, but there's bundling there. There's a lot of money there. And then support contracts, which you're familiar with. This is how contributors keep the doors open. Now, these different ways. So you have to think about that. What do they care about when you're making the demos? Now, as far as users, what do users care about when they're purchasing open source? Based off of the surveys and stuff in this book and others, they care about initial software price. That sounds weird. Yeah, it's total cost of ownership. They're comparing open source people who purchase open source, how much is it total, when it's at, say, an enterprise? How much does it cost completely to use that versus this? Because oftentimes there's closed source involved or something. They have to do something in order to make it work, right? And so that's the initial software price. Switching costs, how much does it cost to switch from one to another? This would be a decision where you have closed source, again, in telco, very much the vendors are making it to where it's hard to switch, right? Interoperability costs is another one. Access to support, access to, and the cost of support, the cost of upgrades and all. This is what people are thinking about. The users are thinking about when they're doing a purchase. And also software quality is there. That's a non-cost component. So again, users, contributors, what do they care about? And now you're making this way to vote. So voting power. This one, again, when I'm saying pay to play, what type of games can be had when there is a coalition that comes through and wants to exercise more power than an individual. It's a difficult thing to account for. You're already in a problem if you make the demos and you make the structure of how it's going to be, who can vote, and all that stuff, and you haven't considered that. So an example would be, you could be a corporation and, we want this feature in on this project that's going to be tailored to our hardware. Whatever. You can have 50 people, 20 people show up from your corporation on the weekly meeting or whatever, and then just constantly filibuster you, all that stuff. It's a real thing. So how are you going to deal with that? You need to be able to reason about that. And this is Voting Power. Book here, Mathematics and Democracy, talks about essentially there's such thing as voting science and trying to deal with the different levels of power for who can vote. So that would be a good book to look at. And so individual developers, obviously, it's one person, one vote, right? And then you have, project growth cycle. So this is really about the contributors. This is a book by Nadia Egal. It's called Working in Public. So when you're reasoning about open source projects, what do the contributors look like? Well, with what they call the federal classification of a project, you have high amount of contributors, high contributor growth, a long tail of contributors, so there could be from different companies and all this stuff, and high user growth. I mean, this is the ultimate project that everybody would love to be the founder of or whatever. But then you have the stadium project. So it's low amount of contributors, low contributor growth, but high amount of users, right? And again, this will bring it back. Thinking about contributors, users are affected by the software, the affected interest principle. So we're talking about voting and all that. That's why you need to reason about it. What are you going to do? High amount, so you can think of, like Bootstrap, JS, or something like that. Smaller amount of contributors, everybody using it. I don't know if people still use it. I haven't done UI development forever, but that would be a project. And then you have the club, which is kind of like the federal, essentially high amount of contributors, high amount of contributor growth, but not a lot of users. It's just contributors. This might be an academic project or what have you. Maybe you could say that contributors are the users, but it's really everybody that's a contributor or everybody that's a user is a contributor. So again, this is what the people who can vote, maybe possibly be able to vote, this is who you're serving when you're trying to say, I'm going to make a governance model for people who participate in decision making. And so again, affected interest, you combine all of those things. And then now you have the ability to reason, finally, about the demos when you're in that pre-political party and all that stuff. Conclusion. So whenever you talk about this subject, there's three questions you have to separate. Whether you should even be a democracy at all, right? That is I was saying earlier, the elephant in the room. Cooperatives, all day long, it's not even a discussion. We're a democracy, one person, one vote. Open source, all of a sudden, benevolent dictatorship because we're being pragmatic, and that's the only way things can work possibly, because we don't want to spend the time to reason about some things, right? But it's legitimate, it's a thing. So maybe you're not a democracy at all. That's a question, but separate it from how to vote. There's different voting structures and all that stuff. How to vote is not who can vote. That's its own beast. This presentation is only about who can vote, right? There's a little bit about how. You can have vetoing, you can have stuff like that. So who initially decide on who governs? We talked about it. We're going to have a two-stage process. This group that needs to give impartial treatment to the second group. That's the bootstrapping solution, right? So you need to be thinking about how, what's fair, how they're affected, all these things, their rights, fruit of their labor, all that. And in order for it to be legitimate, then you will be able to make a legitimate demos. Here's one. So should the vote of the user be implicit or explicit? Everybody within open source will just say, hey, it's based off of consumption and market. If they don't like it, they don't have to use it. People say it all the time, right? Well, that's an implicit vote. You can have an explicit vote. You can have the user bring them in to the vote. The users contribute documentation. They are the ones that know where the bugs are at, where the bodies are at, all this stuff. So if a user contributes some documentation, do they get to define that? Do they get to vote on it? Do they be a part of decision-making process of that? It's kind of, the open source is unique, and this is why I think it's unique for political science. The users are part of the production process, right? And so bringing them in, it could be that they have full voting power, and they can only have maybe veto power. So within telecommunications, you have people consuming this expensive hardware, and they may not know how to make it, but they may say, yeah, we think that feature is really, something that we don't want. It shouldn't be built into an open source project. Let's veto it. Maybe that's the way you go for a user, right? This one comes up all the time. It's really in the category of how you should vote. If you have one contributor who contributes a whole lot, and you have someone else that doesn't contribute that much, do they get the same weighting on their vote? There are systems to handle that. That's how to vote. There's mathematical systems to handle that kind of thing. It's outside the scope of here. But the main idea I'm saying is that is a different problem. You should handle it. If you ever talk about this with someone, people conflate all these together, and it makes you give up. And you do benevolent dictator, enlightened dictatorship, all that. And then what constitutes the contributor user? We talked about that. All of those, what they care about when they purchase, what they care about as far as when they're contributing, and all these other things. And then, counterintuitively, have a bias for over-inclusion. So essentially, you're not really harming if you include too many people because of the concept of they really oftentimes are just apathetic. So within political science, over-inclusion is okay. Under-inclusion is a little worse. But you have to watch out for the bike shed and Parkinson's law. So any questions? I know this is like drinking from fire hydrant. So no. All right, 45 minutes. All right, here we go.
The bit about over-inclusion was interesting. I see that in some projects I'm involved in where we kind of like tend to invite more people into the voting or decision-making process because we see their contributions and want them to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like some sort of a litmus test or something that can kind of help somebody decide if maybe you're being too inclusive in that process?
Those constraints. The constraints. So you're saying, as far as over-inclusion, you've seen it, and what is it that's causing it? You have to go into those constraints to figure out. It seems, I have an intuition, there's too many people in here because we're moving slow. That's kind of what people, but there's all those things. Is it nosy preferences? Is it transience? It might be transience, that type of thing. And then if you can look in political science and say, you know what, they have decided, and it seems legitimate, to exclude transients. Okay, you don't get to be part of the political, the decision-making process or vote or whatever if you haven't been here for a month or 2 months or whatever, that kind of thing. But being able to communicate it and having rationale behind it so it can be legitimate, then there's more power there. If it's kind of, because that's what I felt like, right? Maybe you could do that with programmers, open source developers and all that, but when you start having to deal with people with money and projects who are losing money if they don't get you to do what they say, you need to have something behind it. That's why I'm pretty passionate about this. Yeah, it was her.
I'm interested in a lot of these topics. I'm not even going to try to cover that in 30 seconds. But I just wanted to say this was the best talk that I've seen at this conference.
Thanks.
So I guess I'll just share an idea. So something that I've been thinking about is in the 60s, Arnstein created a ladder of sort of stakeholder inclusion.
Okay.
It's an interesting model that sort of covers this over-inclusion or under-inclusion in a little more nuance, where the top of the ladder is completely delegate, just delegate it over, and the bottom of the ladder is complete exclusion, lie about it, cover it up. So I'm curious if you, this isn't even really a question, but I guess afterwards I would love to chat about
Yeah.
some of that and how we can think about how that applies to our open source communities.
Okay. Yeah, definitely talk to me about that. You said lie about it and cover it up at the bottom.
Well, yeah, well, that's why it's the bottom of the ladder. It's like that sucks, so let's climb up the ladder.
So make it suck for them, and then make them jump through. All right. Yeah. Here we go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want you to have to go on forever about this, but I'm just sort of curious. Can you call out an example in the open source world, if you know of one, that you think did a good job of coming to a conclusion about who should vote and how to vote?
No. No, I mean, you have the super influential person, Bacon, saying, yeah, here are the three types, and this bottom type, it'd be nice if you did that, right? So there are the larger organizations that are more mature, they do that, but then they do pay to play. So
Well, I can think of maybe some.
yeah,
I'll answer my own question.
yeah,
Maybe a little bit. But I think that there are some open source projects that try to do this, or I hope that there are, really.
yeah. I'm sure they are.
But I think like the Debian project, I think is, they don't include users, which is perhaps more of a problem, but still I think they're like part of the way there, They're like trying to get consensus, and they're trying to have a group of decision makers.
Yeah.
It's more flat among those decision makers in other places.
Yeah, I think to say that you're doing good here, you have to be able to communicate that you are giving impartial treatment and all these concepts here. You'd have to say, this is why you are not involved in the vote, users. Like, what's implicit in open source is you're not smart enough. That's really what it is, So some of these things need to be addressed. I'd like to look at Debian, though. They probably are pretty good. He's winning.
Yeah. To come back a little bit to the kind of fruits of labor stuff, I sort of think that like copyleft seems to be like kind of one of the only tools that we've had to exert power, but it's a very blunt tool, and we're only able to extract really one particular kind of fruit from that.
Yeah.
Have you thought about licensing in regards to how contributors can sort of regain control of fruits of labor?
So copyleft, I don't know. There's definitely probably some things you can do for the licensing. It seems like just about anything you can do can be, hacked. So I don't know. But that's a good question. Let's go here.
I want to go back to her comment about the Debian group, and I think the impartial treatment aspect there is that most of those votes end up putting some kind of burden on the maintainer community for some change they have to make or some other kind of thing that they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
So their exclusion of people who aren't maintainers is because if you just said, okay, you 50,000 people, tell us what you think we should do and we're just going to go do it, volunteer maintainers won't do that. They want to know that they have a voice themselves in what they're being told to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably where they make the decision, the distinction between who gets to vote and who doesn't, is that the people who are voting are the same group who are going to be told, maybe, or I guess most affected by the decision itself because they have to do the work to execute it.
Yeah. And this language, the maintainers, right?
Yes.
They are the direct interest. They are directly interested. That's the fruit of labor and all that stuff. And that's a home run to say they get to do what they want. The one that are affected, like if you're making, the open source software for a nuclear facility, right? And it's like, well, you have the people using it, like running the nuclear facility. You got regulators. They're not, running the facility there, but you maybe give them the ability to veto, right?
Yeah.
And so, you could think like veto is a thing. You can have reduced voting for people, right? So that kind of thing. Okay. You said the RFC process and how it's including people. I couldn't really hear it. Is that?
Yeah, I was like, would you agree that isn't good?
I do like the RFC process. There's a book, I'm forgetting the author. The name is Protocol, where it talks about how that process is exploited, and because people think, we didn't go into this, but because people think that they are contributing, it makes it worse because they have buy-in. This is a big part of the book, the participatory democracy. It's called partial participation. And in management science, they are all up. They love for people to get the information, and then, oh yeah, and notice it and stuff like that, and then but they don't actually have decision-making power. There's a way to, it's not exactly the RC process, but that book, Protocol, I can give it to you, or give you the reference later. But it's really good about talking about all of the protocols, like networking protocols and all this stuff, and how they've become even more insidious than, even though they seem completely open and organic and all that stuff. You know, but yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of RCs, is that book. But yeah, anything else? Give people time to go to take a break. Thanks. Oh, thanks.
Make sure to stick around.